Hi, I'm Stephen Prince, the author of Savage Cinema, Sam Peckinpah, and the Rise of Ultraviolent Movies. Let me say it right out. Straw Dogs is Sam Peckinpah's masterpiece and one of the most audacious and brilliantly accomplished American films of the modern period. It's a film that has been attacked and condemned and is now neglected by most film critics and historians. I will try to set the record straight in this commentary and explain why, with all of its perversity and darkness, this is a great film. Peckinpah was at the top of his game when he made this picture, flush with the success of The Wild Bunch. He disorients us from the beginning with this lack of focus. The opening credits unfold over a slowly resolving shot, during which much of the image is indecipherable. He's using the original but discarded opening for The Wild Bunch, in which he had wanted to open with a close-up of an ant nest, with the ants swarming and attacking the scorpion. His producer persuaded him not to begin the film that way, but to open in a more normative, less confusing fashion. Here we've got the swarming, indecipherable shapes that are equivalent to the ants in the earlier film, but when the shot resolves, we see that they are children playing in the graveyard. Note where Peckinpah places his director's credit. As we move toward clarity and the image sharpens, we see the directed by Sam Peckinpah credit, as he suggests that his role in this film will be the provider of dark truth. After the director's credit, we zoom in on this group of children circling the dog. Are they playing with it, or are they tormenting it? The image is teasingly ambiguous. The encirclement motif is carried over into these next two shots, and it will become a major structural feature of the film. It's an image that talks about predatory behavior. A flurry of shots give us impressions of David and Amy as the villagers see them. We see Amy's breasts as a group of boys leer at them. And the cutting separates all of our principal characters, David, Amy, and Charlie Venner. Each is in their own frame, isolated from the others. The editing rhythms are off-kilter, and it's difficult for the viewer to anticipate where the next setups will be. There's an extraordinary tension that Peckinpah's editing is creating even at this early point in the film. That's Janice and Bobby Hedden carrying the trap behind Amy. Those characters, as well as the other village children, including the ones we've seen in the graveyard, originally had an expanded role in early drafts of the film. In one version of the film's ending, they would continue the attack on David and Amy after the adult characters had been killed. The cutting from this point and the framing group Amy with Charlie Venner, rather than with David, her husband.
David is an old friend of mine, Charlie Venner, my husband.
Take a look at the kids up there in the graveyard. They're obviously watching the camera crew and the filming that's going on. Peckinpah kept the shots because I guess he felt that they could as well be looking at the characters, but in fact they're looking at the camera crew. This framing that I was talking about regarding Amy in relation to Charlie, rather than to David, suggests the level of marital tension that already exists between them, but which the viewer can't yet fully appreciate. Peckinpah brings us into this film in the midst of a conflict that has already been simmering for some time, and the framing suggests this.
Yeah, that's a good idea. This fellow Norman...
Now this setup gives us some foreshadowing. We're going to see the animal trap pointed at his head there. It's a little bit like the shot in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, where the birds in Norman Bates's office are pecking at Marion Crane's neck, a future victim.
We'll be there, sir. Good.
Peckinpah described this movie as the story of a bad marriage, and much of the early section of the film will be involved with delineating the problems in that marriage.
David? Where are you going?
Cigarettes.
David abruptly goes off to the pub, making his entrance and catching the eye of Tom Hedden, who stares with a great deal of curiosity at David's shoes. These are not the work boots of a working man. These are American sneakers which brand David as a cultural outsider. He walks in between John Niles and his dartboard. David cannot help but be terminally clumsy. Peckinpah intercuts the action in the pub with shots of Venner and Amy outside the bar. Their dialogue establishes that Amy and Venner have been lovers, that Amy, in fact, is of this village and its culture.
Remember when I took care of you, Amy?
And this is going to be a key point because it will help motivate her behavior later in the film. More important is her behavior when Charlie tries to reassert a sexual involvement with her, and she tells him forcefully to remove his hand.
When you were ready to beg me for it.
Take your hands off me.
Critics have often suggested that Amy is a continual flirt, and yet there is no trace of flirtation in her reaction to Charlie here. We will see that Amy is in fact more deeply committed to the marriage than David, and feels its problems more deeply than him.
Come on, gentlemen, drink up. Let me have the glasses, please.
Back in the bar, we get more indicators of how out of place David is in this working man's pub.
Harry? I think I should have another pint.
Tom Hedden scuffles and cuts his hand on the mug. Watch David's reaction here. He's drawn toward this violence. Unlike Tom, Charlie, and the others, though, who were comfortable with this level of physical aggression, David is not. But it's not because he's not yet a real man or any of the other things that critics have claimed Peckinpah is saying in the film. David is not comfortable with it because it's not his style. As we will see, he is more passively aggressive. And, as we will see, he is more filled with rage than any character in the film. David is the villain of this film. To Peckinpah, he is the character who provokes all of the violence that occurs. Amy, by contrast, is the character whose ordeal registers the impact and consequence of that violence. Peter Vaughan is magnificently malevolent as Tom, this huge hulking presence. Watch this associative edit when he slams the door. There's David crossing his legs, as if he's sexually threatened. This film is very disturbing because its violence hits on so many levels, especially the sexual level. It's a very primitive world that Peckinpah is depicting here, with characters driven by base desires and force and violence asserting the ultimate laws. Peckinpah, though, is not saying that any of this is right. He's an ironist. He portrays the opposite of what he believes in, and this is a tactic that has always confounded his critics.
What I am. This is damage, Harry.
All of the actors in this film give such transparent performances that they seem to vanish into the characters. It's hard for me, for example, to see Peter Vaughan in movies now because I can't accept him in roles other than this one. The film is sometimes criticized on the grounds that the characters are more caricatures. There is a certain broadness to the Hedden gang, and yet Peckinpah's style is not fundamentally a realistic one. This is a very stylized film. Tom exits the bar and boasts, "I showed 'em, didn't I, lads?"
I showed him, eh, lads?
This boast tells us that his bluster was really a performance for the Yank. David's presence in the village is already inciting turmoil, and he's going to inflame it now when he insists on paying for his own cigarettes, topping Tom's gesture to do the same. The film was shot in the village of St. Buryan, which is a stone village. And in the production design of this picture, the stones are a very important part of the way the film feels. It's such a cold and hard movie that the granite exteriors on the buildings furnish a way of visualizing that. St. Buryan is a very old community, and this area in Cornwall includes prehistoric stone circles that date from 2000 BC. The world that Peckinpah presents is a very primitive world, and the locations that he chose convey it and give it a kind of physical presence. The title of the film is very enigmatic. Almost no one who sees the picture knows what a straw dog is. The term derives from the Book of Changes by Lao Tzu, a famous passage that says roughly, "Heaven and earth are cruel. They treat all living things as straw dogs." A straw dog is an ornament used in a Chinese ceremony. It's meant to be used once and then discarded. So the idea is that a straw dog is something that has a brief purpose and then is cast aside. Peckinpah, I think, keyed in on the idea of cruelty in this quote, the notion of a ruthlessness. It had an immediate applicability to the film, and as I've said, the term itself, straw dogs, is interestingly enigmatic. It sounds very mysterious in a way that could be marketed in the film's favor. The term straw dogs tends to simplify the meaning of the Tao Te Ching, the Book of Changes. In a fuller context, the notion there is that although from the viewpoint of the individual being, whose life is short and brief, although this is a kind of cruelty on the part of nature or heaven or the Creator, that there's a larger pattern, a larger picture here, that each life has its moment, and then once it is cast aside or perished, its constituent materials will be reassembled and recreated. So in a larger context, the ruthlessness of that line in the Book of Changes is part of a larger reassuring pattern, a cosmic harmony. The cosmic harmony doesn't equate well with the film, and so it was probably just the term cruelty and ruthlessness, as they appear in different translations of the line, that intrigued Peckinpah.
Real antiques, sir. Rare they are. My wife is a collector.
This movie was made in 1971 during a period of heightened social and political turmoil in the United States, and the dialogue here references this period.
I hear it's pretty rough in the States, sir.
Oh, have you seen some of it, sir? Bombing, rioting, sniping, shooting the blacks. Can't walk down the streets, they say, Norman.
Was you involved in it, sir? I mean, did you take part?
See anybody get knifed?
Just between commercials.
David's response, "just between commercials," is an important line. It seems like a casual and thrown-away remark, but it actually references a major obsession of Peckinpah's, the role of television and the mass media in contemporary society. Peckinpah felt that the media were helping sell the war by packaging its violence between commercials. He also felt that movies in general operated this way, and he tried very hard in Straw Dogs to avoid doing that. Straw Dogs is a film that seems disconnected from a time and perhaps even a place, and yet it is a film very much of the late 60s, early 1970s. In part, this story about an arrogant American in a foreign land seeking to impose his will can be read as a distant parable about the Vietnam War. I don't mean to suggest here that Peckinpah is making a film about Vietnam, but he's telling a story that can't help but resonate with the contemporary social situation about which he cared very deeply. This period of time was also a great period for American film. It has, in fact, been called the last golden age in American cinema. This is the time when Peckinpah thrived. The late 60s, early 1970s were the era of pictures like The French Connection, Five Easy Pieces, Harold and Maude, Alice's Restaurant. Raw films made without conventional polish. Movies that were made because the filmmakers felt they had an original and interesting story to tell, not because the pictures would make a lot of money. During the 5 years from 1969 to 1974, Peckinpah was on fire with creativity, and he did his best work then. The Wild Bunch, The Ballad of Cable Hogue, Straw Dogs, Junior Bonner, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. After this, his personal demons overwhelmed him and destroyed his ability to work. So his peak then was a very short interval, only 5 years, but the work he did then has had tremendous impact and influence, mainly through the way that he stylized cinematic violence using multi-camera filming, montage, and slow motion. The Wild Bunch, for example, launched him to prominence in 1969 with these techniques. This is a deliciously vicious act of aggression against David. Amy's changing the equation sign on that blackboard. The Wild Bunch is generally regarded as Peckinpah's masterpiece, and while it's a great film, it was also partly a failure. He had wanted to showcase the horror of violence, but the violence there is so bound up with genre, with the Western, that it becomes heroic, sentimental and transcendent. He never made that mistake again, and in his later films, most especially this one, he was more careful to place violence within a bleak dramatic context, rather than the glory and heroism of the Wild Bunch. In this respect, Straw Dogs shows a significant evolution in his understanding of violence and how it should be done for the screen. It's also the most controlled of Peckinpah's films. Many of his movies have a kind of rambling quality in which you're in a scene that is playing and you sense that Peckinpah is looking for its focus. But every scene in this film has a razor-sharp clarity. This interlude of tenderness and play between David and Amy characteristically gives way to more tension.
Why don't you take my heater out of the study?
Because it's going upstairs.
They squabble about where the heater is going to go, and David asserts that it belongs in his study because his comfort essentially is more important than Amy's comfort.
It's not going upstairs.
It's freezing in there.
Here is a scene, Amy joking with Norman and Chris, that critics who are opposed to the film cite as evidence that she teases the workmen sexually, gradually provoking them until they attack her. The scene rather seems to work to establish Amy's ease and comfort with her own people. She is, after all, of this village. They will betray her, physically and emotionally, as David will betray her emotionally. And it is important for the logic of the film that this parallel betrayal be established. Compare her easy interaction with Norman and Chris with the strained and tense exchange that now unfolds with David in his study. She tells him that Norman and Chris find him strange. And like all of the dialogue in this film, this is dialogue that indicates a deeper level of meaning.
They just think you're strange.
It suggests that Norman and Chris have talked with her about David. She also suggests that she finds David strange. This interaction between them is very destructive. David encourages her to behave as a child, and then he criticizes her for doing so. He's married a woman who he feels will never challenge him intellectually, and he treats her with a measure of contempt. It's a behavioral flaw in David, and it's a flaw that he shows toward others as well.
Want to try for 12?
David is a character who carries a lot of rage inside, and it interferes with his ability to relate to Amy. That's something that Peckinpah was quite familiar with. As a man, he struggled with his own rages, and they tended to corrupt many relationships in his own life. He was very familiar with a litany of failed romantic relationships and failed friendships. So there is a sense in which the contours of David as a character map onto some of the psychological contours of Peckinpah. The marriage, in fact, is a war zone. It's a battleground. And much of the film is spent delineating these tensions. The toaster is another subject of contention between them. Amy puts it on the counter, and she's going to leave it on the breakfast table for David to find in the morning. Ridaway drives up now to pick up Chris Causey and Norman, and we've got some great dialogue here. Peckinpah was an extraordinary writer of dialogue, and it often has a very peculiar quality. One of the dying outlaws, for example, in The Wild Bunch, goes out with a defiant, "Well now, how'd you like to kiss my sister's black cat's ass?" Peckinpah typically rewrote much of his dialogue to give it this quality. The great line in Straw Dogs, uttered by Chris Causey, comes here.
See around these parts is a rat. Mr. Sumner. Rats is life.
Rats is life. It's a perfect summary statement of the world in this film, turned upside down, where destruction and aggression reign supreme. There's also a delight here. Peckinpah found his savage characters to be very endearing, while he was simultaneously appalled at their brutal behavior. Things are always mixed, he said, and it's this that gives his movies their strange off-kilter quality. He mixes up emotions and experiences that other filmmakers keep separate, and it keeps the viewer chronically off balance. Straw Dogs is a film with numerous backstories, all of them fraught with tension. All of the characters in this movie are at one another's throats. Major Scott enters the bar, and he's greeted by Tom and his gang, but it's a tense greeting.
With me then, Major.
Not tonight, I'll buy my own.
Tom Hedden repeatedly tries to draw the Major into having a drink with him, but Scott refuses, knowing that if he drinks with Tom, they will probably brawl, and then he'll have to arrest him. Notice that Major Scott is got his arm in a sling. T.P. McKenna, who plays the character, was injured in a brawl during pre-production of the film, and it works for the character in an odd way. It suggests the weakness of law in this primitive world. We've got another backstory here involving John Niles.
Your brother. Been hanging around the girls again. You'd better keep a closer watch or we'll be putting him away.
John's son Henry is the village child molester, and this provokes Tom to warn John to keep an eye on Henry.
Too much for that sod. Watch your tongue, Norman.
Part of what makes the violence in this film so intense is the excruciatingly tense psychological atmosphere that precedes it. It comes out of this emotional climate of antagonism that permeates the village. There were two films that came out in 1971 that took violence as their theme, this one and Clockwork Orange by Stanley Kubrick. In the years since, Clockwork Orange has gone on to achieve a certain degree of legitimacy and respectability. Straw Dogs has gone underground in some ways. It's fallen out of film history. And yet, if you look at the two movies, it is Straw Dogs that has the greater power to upset and agitate viewers. Viewed today, Clockwork Orange seems a little bit calculated, a little bit manipulative, and somewhat artificial in its vision of a future world. In Straw Dogs, Peckinpah is able to place his violence within a more naturalistic kind of social context that gives it a much sharper cutting edge. This is the first clear sign we have that David is a man with some serious problems. He talks to Amy as if nothing is happening downstairs, and yet he's torturing the cat, hitting it with fruit. Peckinpah does most of this with sound information. Notice that the cat is really off frame, and we hear it reacting as if it's being hit by the fruit. So there is no real animal cruelty involved here in this scene. We go now to the Hedden children climbing up on the roof where they can spy on Amy and David in their bedroom. Peckinpah is now going to give us one of the oddest and creepiest scenes in the film. This is going to be a peculiarly presented scene in which Peckinpah will be cutting away from the playful interactions of the couple to the bedroom mirror. And he's going to show us their play and their lovemaking with mirrored images that are going to intrude on the action. It's an optical device. He'll be cutting into a straightforward presentation of the action. None of this intercutting is in the script. It's something that Peckinpah created in the scene during filming, as he did with so much else in the picture. The mirror is a significant symbol for Peckinpah. He uses mirror shots throughout his work to suggest conditions of alienation. Very often his characters see themselves in the mirror, and it makes them uneasy. He was drawn to characters who are broken. For Peckinpah, in fact, the personality was fragmented. All of his principal characters are badly integrated people. Here he cuts back and forth between Amy and David on camera and their reflected images. He uses the mirror shots, as we've just seen, to convey this fractured sense of self. These are strange compositions, especially the ones coming up where we see David and Amy's lovemaking in the mirror. The mirror shots intrude on the action. They're going to be distancing us from the characters.
I think I have it. Ooh. That puts you in.
That's her cue for him. But instead of making love to his wife, David is going to torment her a little bit. David's going to go through this maddening ritual of removing his wristwatch. You can see how odd these are, how intrusive. Taking off his glasses. Amy begins to get frustrated with him, and just when you might think he's ready, he decides that he's got to wind the alarm clock.
Christ's sake.
I'm just setting the alarm.
I'd like to return to the significance of these shots. The mirrored shots are not point-of-view shots that show what the hidden children see, and this makes their usage more interesting yet. The editing here invites the viewer to make the connection between the apparent intimacy of the marital bed, which we see when the characters are directly on camera, and the underlying emotional alienation that is the true reality of this bad marriage, and that Peckinpah uses the mirrored images to suggest. The mirrors, therefore, become a kind of Brechtian device, pulling us away momentarily to encourage reflection on the nature of what we are seeing. Peckinpah wanted his viewers to extract a lesson from this film, not to be overwhelmed by its drama and its spectacle. The mirror shots interrupt our relationship to the scene and its action, and Peckinpah hoped that they would encourage the kind of reflection he wanted his viewers to have. Now comes a key shot, David removing his shirt that will figure importantly later on during the rape scene. Peckinpah is going to go out of the scene now with brilliant, jagged transitions. We go from this lovemaking to the action in the pub of Norman with Amy's panties, building on the sexual content of the previous scene and pointing to the later confrontation between Norman and Charlie over Amy.
Amy, don't play games with me.
We go now to the sudden onset of the argument between Amy and David.
You're not being fair.
I've noted that the film has a very staccato editing style, and in one sense this is familiar to viewers today. A lot of our movies featured quick editing and continuity violations that films made 50 years ago did not have. Peckinpah was very radical in his editing approach, but in a bigger sense, that was part of the revolutionary style of late 60s, early 70s films. So Peckinpah was not the only director in the period who was making films in this way. If you look at a lot of the movies from that time, pictures like Harold and Maude or The French Connection, you'll see some of the elements of what Peckinpah is doing in Straw Dogs, though not to the extent that he practices them here. Listen to the way that Jerry Fielding's music plays the tension between them. Look at the way that Peckinpah gives the camera to Amy's anguish. Peckinpah draws close to her because her anguish is the heart of this film. And he hangs on that, and he hangs on David's coldness toward her. Here, as elsewhere, things are implicit. She's reaching out to him, trying for a closeness that will sustain the marriage. But David is an isolate. He cannot sustain that sort of intimacy, and this current rebuff is unbearable for Amy. This scene and its psychodynamics, David's coldness toward her, Amy's anguish and her anger over the collapse of her marriage, motivates the subsequent events in the film, such as this one here, where she drives up and the workmen see her adjusting her pantyhose. The look on her face, when she glances up, is quite opaque. It's cold, it's defiant. There's an I see you and I know you're looking at me quality there. Peckinpah was always very good with reaction shots. He gives us a sustained series of reaction shots as everyone looks at everyone and takes the measure of each other. She goes inside and tries to get David riled up about them looking at her body. David, though, gives her no real response. He just tells her to wear a bra. This business about wearing or not wearing a bra is another element of the film that keys in on the sexual politics of the period. Bralessness was a way of connoting a kind of freedom in late 60s political culture. Neither David nor Amy really sees how explosive the situation around the home is becoming. And she tells him that if he could hammer a nail, then they wouldn't really need to be out there. Both of them have mutual resentments about the inadequacies and failures of the other. What comes now is a really terrible argument.
You left because I got a grant to do work, which I haven't found the time to do.
You left because you didn't want to take a stand. Commit.
David's reply
Commit to what?
is a line that was looped in post-production. His original reply was fuller and contained explicit references to late 60s political culture, to things like political radicals blowing up banks and anti-war protest on college campuses. Peckinpah decided to remove these lines from the film after he conferred with his producers. The replacement lines that we hear, "You want something out of me that it's not right to deliver. That's not what I was there for," are general lines that do not explicitly evoke the late 60s political culture. This is an unusual strategy. The film is both deeply in its time and of that time, and yet Peckinpah removed most of the explicit references that would tie it there. Look at this master shot. The wide-angle lens exaggerates the depth and space of the room, and he's got all this area between David and Amy, sitting across from one another at opposite ends of the room. Much of the dialogue that follows now is going to be presented in a series of alternating close-ups, as the framing will isolate each character. Realizing that she's hurt David, Amy apologizes, but he starts another of his manipulative games. He encourages her to be childish by asking if she's sorry.
Are you sorry? Or just sorry?
You can see that she's reluctant to get into this game with him.
Sorry.
Come here.
But she gets up and goes over and sits awkwardly next to him, and Peckinpah goes to this setup. The camera is behind them. The sofa blocks our view. It's a very distanced, dissociated view of the characters. It underscores their lack of intimacy, as does Jerry Fielding's dissonant music.
I think I do.
Amy says that she needs a bath. That's a significant remark. It's as if she feels soiled by the continual turmoil with David and wants to wash this off of her. When she goes upstairs, one of the film's most controversial moments follows, and critics who are opposed to the film find this scene to be quite inflammatory. Amy is going to expose herself at the upstairs window. It's a blatant act of provocation when she stands there in full view of the workmen. It's the only one that she commits in the film. But the context for this action is important and makes it psychologically credible and complex. It has followed the terrible argument with David and his inability to respond to her. Here is another one of these opaque expressions. It's defiant, but it is not sultry or inviting. She's acting from her anger at David and her disgust at them. As always, the dynamics of Peckinpah's characters are complex.
Thinking?
This is a real jewel of a scene. This is one of the longest shots in the film. It runs about 40 seconds, which is an extraordinary length of time in a movie that's cut as tightly as this one. The barrenness of their emotional terrain gets a perfect expression in the wintry Cornwall countryside, so devoid of color, raw and rainy. This little scene is like a haiku. It treats landscape as emotional poetry and concentrates emotion into compact, highly expressive form. John and Henry Niles walk by, reminding us of their presence in the village and alluding to where events in the film will be going.
David? I can't find the cat.
Can you forget the cat and let me work for a minute?
Peckinpah was unable to depict healthy relationships between men and women. But he was brilliant at conveying marriages and love affairs in states of decay and disintegration, catching the everyday tensions and hostilities that deform domestic life. Straw Dogs is his most accomplished film in this respect, and commentators who see only the physical violence of the picture, the rape and then the siege of the house, tend to miss the significance of the long build-up to those events, the way they are located within a psychological context that already contains so much animosity. That's why this is one of the tensest films that's ever been made. There is no moment where the tension abates, where characters can just enjoy being with one another, be peaceful. The alienation that we see in the film between the characters is chronic and unsparing. David is such a klutz. You can't help but share the gang's amusement at his inability to adjust to English automobiles. The psychological tension that I've been discussing motivates the eruption of physical violence. And it's something that Peckinpah has perfectly replicated in his camera setups and editing. In this respect, the common critical approach to the movie is off the mark. This approach sees the film as a kind of sophomoric thesis statement of the territorial imperative, the idea that violence is instinctually rooted in animal life as a response to incursions of territory. The encirclement motif in the film does express this idea, but it is not a thesis in the film. When Peckinpah made the film, he was taken with the work of anthropologist Robert Ardrey, whose books in the late 60s, African Genesis, The Territorial Imperative, and The Social Contract, were read by Peckinpah. Ardrey argued that human aggression is rooted in our evolutionary past and its animal origins. He wrote that we were born of risen apes, not fallen angels, and the apes were armed killers. Most critics have dismissed this movie as a simple-minded dramatization of Ardrey's ideas, with David's defense of the home consistent with the idea of the territorial imperative.
Oh, he's all right. Aren't you Henry?
Promoting the film, Peckinpah spoke frequently of Ardrey and praised his ideas, thus encouraging critics to see the movie as just a celebration of a kind of caveman ethic. Let me pause for a moment to point out this associative edit that's coming up. When John slaps Henry, we cut to David as if he is taking the blow. It's an edit very much like the one that occurs when Tom smashes the mug in the bar, and we see David crossing his legs. Let me return to the idea of the territorial imperative now. Critics have called the film a fascist work. They've called it a hymn to male violence. Peckinpah could be his own worst enemy, and he baited these critics and discredited the movie by saying things like, this picture is about what happens when you deny your basic instincts, and it's wrong to refuse to acknowledge the animal nature of man. This encouraged critics to dismiss the movie as reactionary and Neanderthal. But Peckinpah was a skilled dramatist, and he would really be suspicious of taking such a simplistic approach to behavior. We have seen, in fact, that he shows great skill and sensitivity in showing the problems between David and Amy. In this film, Peckinpah, in fact, shows something other than Robert Ardrey's territorial imperative. The violence resides in warped and twisted relationships, and in the kind of rage that David carries about with him, and that Peckinpah only knew too well in his own life.
I like a Scotch, double.
Peckinpah himself noted that violence came from places other than those of animal impulse. These were psychological conditions of alienation. He said that violence grows from frustration, from the inability to communicate on a verbal level. This view entails a more rationalist view of aggression. In fact, the basis of Peckinpah's worldview is not the Hobbesian jungle and its struggle for survival, but a rationalist commitment to democracy and order that provide the civilized underpinnings of human life. Critics who misread the film have overlooked Peckinpah's tendency to say and show the opposite of what he really meant.
I thought perhaps we could drive up together. See, I wanted to have the good Reverend and Mrs. Hood talk you into joining us at the church social this coming Thursday. The vicar will run me home.
Can I buy you a drink, Major, before you go?
No, thank you, Tom.
David shows a bit of bravado here by offering to pay for everyone's drinks.
Buy them all one.
The gang serenades him, as he leaves, with a deliciously perverse song. It's one of those twisted, how'd you like to kiss my sister's black cat's ass Peckinpah moments. This song is a paean to unbridled sexual lust, seeking all available outlets. These guys would find the sheep's Byron noise to be romantic.
But my love's warm and beautiful and makes a barren noise.
More seriously, though, in psychodynamic terms, we've seen David repeatedly drawn to these characters. They represent his inner desires. This is one of the film's key scenes. It's a brilliantly constructed masterpiece of domestic tension. David is angry, he's a little bit drunk, and he finds the Reverend there. His response is to go and play this obnoxiously loud music, which will effectively kill all conversation.
What are you drinking, Reverend? Stop.
Look at the way that Amy watches David. Critics have described her as a kind of imbecilic child woman, but throughout the scene, she will be behaving as the adult to David's child. Significantly, it's Amy who turns the music off. She reminds David why the Reverend is here. But David turns it into a monetary exchange. Insulting the Reverend, he reaches for his wallet immediately. And Peckinpah cuts to Amy's view of this transaction.
Time is a little difficult to find these days. So are cats. By the way, Amy, did you find your kitty? Kitty?
No.
Susan George's performance is magnificent. It's not even a performance. She becomes this character.
And charity.
The dialogue now segues into a discussion about why David is here, and he tells them this crazy idea about his profession.
Well, tell us what you do.
Okay. I'm a astromathematician.
Ah.
Makes it up as a way of being rude and boorish. Look at Amy's reaction. She goes and fills the Major's drink. She understands this behavior because she's seen David do it at so many parties. David and the Reverend are now going to be drawn into a little parlor game of intellectual one-upmanship. David wins this debate by flourishing the quote from Montesquieu's Persian Letters, a classic work of French Enlightenment philosophy published in 1721. It was a work whose rationalist opposition to religious orthodoxy would appeal to him.
After all, there's never been a kingdom given to so much bloodshed as that of Christ.
Hood's wife asks, "Who's that about Montesquieu?"
Who's he?
Somebody well worth reading.
And his response tells us that this is another bad marriage. One can watch the scene without seeing any of these psychodynamics, so quickly are they conveyed. Sensing David's hostility to religion, the Reverend's wife asks Amy if God bores her.
In the areas of boredom, Mrs. Hood, God is not my problem.
Anytime.
My wife tells me you play an interesting game.
Amy, therefore, gets the last word.
You were awful to the Reverend.
No, I wasn't.
Her remark points to the source of her anguish. She's committed to sustaining this bad marriage, but she's perceptive enough to understand how difficult this is going to be. David, by contrast, drifts through the marriage and his life, gripped by compulsions that he poorly understands. In fact, Dustin Hoffman felt that it was not fully believable that his character would have married such a woman, and he argued with Peckinpah about this. But Peckinpah's instincts about David's preferences were right. David and Amy's main channel of communication is sexual. We see that again in this scene. Amy accepts this, but she wants more. For David, sex is just fine.
You're a bright lady. You're not so dumb.
Peckinpah has the reputation of being a director who hates women, and there is plenty of brutality toward them in his films. But there is also an enduring pattern in his work in which the women are better than the men, more deserving of the men who time and again fail them and betray them. We see that here. Now the film turns around. What has been the dissection of a bad marriage veers in a more sinister direction. Some critics want to offer a playful interpretation. Maybe it was David who killed the cat. We've seen him being cruel to it, after all. And he allows Amy to go up to the closet and view it for herself. And look at the mirror on the vanity table behind him and the mirror here with Amy. This playful interpretation of who killed the cat is off the mark. Although we never do learn who killed it, it's likely Chris Causey or Norman. This cutaway to the house intensifies our feeling of threat. The house is very isolated, and therefore so too are David and Amy. It's also a moment of emotional bracketing, and shows that Peckinpah is a moral filmmaker in control of his material. It gives the viewer a moment to breathe after this shocking revelation. One doesn't see this kind of emotional bracketing much in violent movies today because directors are more intent just on beating viewers over the head with a lot of graphic violence. Peckinpah, though, was discreet and careful about the way he would show violence. The tension level in the film has now ratcheted up even higher than it has been, and Peckinpah finds a perfect embodiment for the structural design of the film. It's that clock that David's winding and the way that he keeps cranking the spring until the tension on it explodes the mechanism.
David, a complete stranger, comes into our house and decides to strangle our cat and hang her in the wardrobe. Somebody passing.
Peckinpah is going to show us violence on every level. Physical violence, verbal violence, psychological violence, sexual violence, violence against property, and against people. In this respect, Straw Dogs is the purest expression of Peckinpah's deepest interest as an artist, which is to inquire into the nature of violence, and to show it as a plague, and not with the kind of heroics that usually accompany it in the movies. It's a film with absolute coldness and cruelty. There's nothing in this movie of an affirmative nature. The affirmations that he does make lie in the way the movie points beyond itself, toward the kind of life that we don't see on screen here. Just as the overwhelmed clock in the previous scene gives us a marvelous emblem for the way the story is tightening around the characters, Peckinpah gives us an even better one here. It's those magnets on David's desk, two of the same poles moving in a state of perpetual opposition, locking down on one another and then flying off. It's a closed system of antagonism, just like the characters in this film. There's a sense in the movie that David needs to take a stand, and this scene points toward that. It's the source of Amy's frustration for him.
You don't think that's enough, do you?
Not quite.
The score for Straw Dogs is unpleasant sounding, and it needs to be. Fielding said this was the hardest film he ever had to score because it went so horrifyingly beyond where you thought it was going to go, and the music needed to convey that. Like the movie, the music is all ice and despair. David exits from the office, and Peckinpah cuts back to the magnets, letting them have the last word in this scene. We go in now to the "I'm going to catch them off guard" scene. It showcases the invaluable contribution of Jerry Fielding's music. Listen to its subliminal contribution throughout. Amy is a feisty character. Her feistiness is another element in the character that Peckinpah felt an alliance with. It's the basis for his criticism with David. David is not willing to take a stand. Amy is. She has a courage that David seems to lack. We bring the bear trap now into the room, and Peckinpah is going to give us a montage showing the setting of that trap. In his editing notes, he was very keen about getting these shots right. An early cut of the film showed a lot of the action from the master shot perspective, and he wanted instead to do it with a lot of fragmentary close-ups. It's a marvelous prop, and the general law of good filmmaking is that when you have a marvelous prop, use it right. And Peckinpah is not going to disappoint us. David watches all of this from a distance. He fears these men and the unspoken hostility in the room that their presence brings. Look at the way that Peckinpah breaks the action of setting the trap into 12 separate shots. The abundance of framings serves to prolong the action and sustain the tension. Adding to our off-balance feeling are the reaction shots of David, in two of which his eye lines are not properly matched to the direction of Charlie and Norman. This is not consciously noticed by viewers, but they certainly feel it. It's a key element of Peckinpah's visual strategy, which is to disrupt conventional continuity by mismatching screen direction and using eccentrically placed and oddly angled camera setups. Watching the scene, the viewer can't really anticipate where the flow of visual action will go. And now we go into a prolonged standoff. Look at the blocking of the action at each character's position. Everybody is backed off from everyone else, in a defensive posture as if bracing for attack. David is going to wedge himself into a little corner of space between the table and the clock. Charlie and Chris have got their backs against the fireplace, retreating as far from the others as they can.
Would you like to shoot with us sometime?
Norman has put a chair between himself and leans against it. There's Norman with the chair. The framing breaks the characters apart from one another into separate 1 and 2 shots, and nobody does reaction shots like Peckinpah. Amy watches David, Norman watches Amy, Charlie watches Amy, Amy glances back at David. A series of 10 reaction shots only contains 3 shots in which the camera is on a character who is speaking. In the rest, the characters eye one another uneasily, measuring the tension, pursuing private agendas of their own, and these private agendas, cutting in so many different directions, give the scene its remarkable volatility. You can even see the roof on the set on this shot, accentuating the claustrophobic feeling. The jagged editing, the off-kilter camera setups, the mismatched continuity make the scene so tense and unpredictable.
We'll meet at Wakely about 8:30. You know the pub?
Peckinpah was a director for whom editing was supremely important. Indeed, he often found his films, created them in the editing. He'd want to edit and re-edit his movies, and nobody could pull him out of the editing room until it was time to start the next project. He did not shoot on this film a greater than normal amount of footage, but he did employ a huge number of camera setups, as we saw, for example, in the scene where the men are setting the trap. And he uses these to break each action apart into tiny fragments and build a synthetic sense of the whole out of these fragments. His disregard for conventional continuity, the mismatched eye lines, the odd camera setups, was quite intentional. And it's one reason the film keeps viewers on edge even during its first half. With The Wild Bunch in 1969, Peckinpah exploded the normal editing patterns of American cinema with a movie that contained more shots than any in history to that time. With The Wild Bunch, Straw Dogs is his most aggressively edited film, a work of brilliant montage in which he extends some of the things he was doing in The Wild Bunch. The weird-looking footage that Peckinpah was producing alarmed the film's first editor. This was a very traditional, old-school English editor who was assigned to the picture, and he started to send panicky memos to the executives at the production company saying the footage was incoherent and it couldn't be cut together. Producer Daniel Melnick assured the editor that whatever else might be true about Peckinpah's footage, it assuredly would cut together. But the editor couldn't be convinced and was replaced. This was an odd replay of an almost identical incident on Peckinpah's second feature, Ride the High Country, when an old-time editor at MGM pronounced that footage incoherent and impossible to edit. These incidents demonstrate how far ahead of the stylistic norms of the time Peckinpah was taking his filmmaking. To edit Straw Dogs, Peckinpah wanted to use Lou Lombardo, his Wild Bunch editor, but Lombardo was unavailable. He was working with Robert Altman at the time on McCabe and Mrs. Miller. English guild laws restricted Peckinpah to one American on the crew, so he wound up employing a trio of English editors, Tony Lawson, Paul Davies, and Roger Spottiswoode. Spottiswoode is an especially gifted editor and would work with Peckinpah again on Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and then go on to become a feature film director. Tony Lawson worked with Peckinpah again on Cross of Iron. Exercising his prerogative to have an American on the crew, Peckinpah brought in Robert Wolfe. And Wolfe became the closest and most important editor of Peckinpah's career, working on those pictures that became his best edited work. This one, The Wild Bunch, Junior Bonner, and The Getaway.
I will.
Good luck, sir.
Unlike the troubled production of Pat Garrett, which had 6 editors, Straw Dogs was a very smooth shoot after a rocky start during which Peckinpah drank himself into the hospital and was told that he risked being fired by producer Martin Baum. Fearing this, Peckinpah buckled down, and he worked with the kind of fierce purity of concentration that he brought to only one other film, The Wild Bunch. The fact, then, that Straw Dogs had 4 editors did not signal what it typically signals in films of this period, namely a picture in trouble. It signaled quite the opposite, a filmmaker working at the height of his powers, producing a mountain of complex, untraditional footage that required a team of editors to assemble. We get a good illustration of Peckinpah's montage abilities in this tail end of the scene on the moor, where David is shooting at the birds with great frustration. Narratively, in terms of the story, what's happening here is relatively slight, but as a construction, it receives extended treatment from Peckinpah in terms of the number of shots that he presents and the variety of camera setups. Now we come to it, the film's most notorious sequence and one of the most horrifying scenes that an American director has ever put on the screen. More than anything else in the film, this is the scene for which critics have condemned it, suggesting that the action expresses one of the most terrible rape myths, namely that women ask for it and enjoy it. It is the tenderness that passes between Charlie and Amy amid the brutality and the attack that has invited this interpretation of the scene. Without question, Peckinpah is being audacious in building the scene this way. In this respect, the scene is a product of the more liberal film culture of the 1960s, and it reflects the different sexual politics of that period, namely an era before the impact of the women's movement had registered on the culture. No male director today, for example, would film such a scene, nor is it likely that the industry would permit him to do so. Rather than using time in the commentary to describe criticism of the scene, however, I'd like to examine how it is constructed and what this design seems to be suggesting. Amy invites Charlie to stay a moment because she wants to ask him about the cat. This is another moment where she's being very forthright in a way that we don't see in David. Her response here is very mixed.
Please leave me.
Charlie has been a former lover, and she is at this point in the film feeling terribly alienated from her husband. The next time that she asks Charlie to go, however, and to stop, it will be without any ambivalence whatsoever.
Get out!
When Charlie hits her now, we go to one of the most shocking and disturbing slow-motion inserts in the entire film. Drawing out Amy's agony to an almost unbearable length, despite the fact that the insert is very brief. Subjectively, for the viewer, it feels terribly long. Amy backs into the same corner that David had stood in earlier.
Please.
She responds with pure terror now and hits him in return, prompting a more savage assault. This action of dragging her by the hair is inflammatory material. It has led many critics to describe the picture as a kind of caveman picture. Charlie rips the robe from her back, tosses her onto the couch, and at this point in the film, Peckinpah will change his visual design drastically. Until now, we've had an exterior view of the action. We go now to an interior, subjective view of the assault. Peckinpah will give us a series of point-of-view shots using the wide-angle lens to distort Charlie's face, showing it to us as Amy sees it. These shots are significant because they place the viewer inside the violence as it is occurring, and this is chiefly what makes the film so disturbing. In most movies, we are comfortably outside the violence that we see. Peckinpah here, though, breaks down that comfortable space. The subjective shots are also significant because they replicate Amy's point of view. Amy, in fact, is the character with whom Peckinpah visually identifies. No other character in the film gets subjective point of view shots. Peckinpah will use them here, and he will use them in 2 scenes during the aftermath of the rape to show the impact of this violence upon the victim. This is an important point because it goes to one of the chief criticisms of the scene, which suggests that Peckinpah's point of view here, in a sense, is from the attacker's perspective. During the editing of the scene, there was tremendous correspondence between Peckinpah and his producers about how to present the material. In an early cut of the film, much of the action played out in this kind of master shot framing, and his producers suggested that that was too sexual, that it was overly explicit. And Peckinpah decided then to play much of the scene using close-ups like this. Here is the subjective associated imagery that blends David and the rapist, as Amy makes the connection between them. This series of shots is a flurry of images, many of which are only a few frames long. It's a kind of subliminal editing. Peckinpah was very fond of it and called it flash cutting. His idea is to impress the connection between David and the rapist upon the viewer in the way that Amy feels it, by making it a felt connection rather than one that is perceived. In other words, many of the shots are too quick to see clearly what is happening. We're now into that section of the rape where most of the action is going to be playing out on the tighter framings, the close-ups. And at this point, Amy begins to show a measured response to Charlie. She is still clearly very upset and experiencing this as what it is, a terrible assault. And yet at the same time, there is tenderness in her response. It is this mixed set of emotions that makes the scene so volatile and so off-putting for the viewer. Peckinpah is not giving us clear moral anchors. He's not giving us a clear set of references to determine who is good and who is bad here. Tenderness and rage go hand in hand. The intercutting of the action here with the shots of David out on the moor was in the script. The action as scripted is structured as cross-cut action. But the subjective imagery was not scripted. Peckinpah created that during the filming as a way of identifying with Amy. We have seen a lot of violence in films since Straw Dogs, and viewers today have become desensitized to violence. Filmmakers often have to do more and more and more horrible things to get the same response. And yet this scene, filmed so many years ago, continues to have the power to shock and disturb viewers. Many viewers can watch The Wild Bunch and not feel upset because the violence there is embedded in genre. But this violence is disturbing. This is radical filmmaking that goes to the core of what violent art, as opposed to violent entertainment, is about. In his classic book, Violence in the Arts, British critic John Fraser argued that the radical potential of violent art lies in its ruthless interrogation of the nature of life and the cruelty that it inflicts upon its viewers. He wrote that it hurts the reader or viewer to be involved in this process. No scene in the film more exemplifies this idea than the attack on Amy. This is violence that rips the viewer apart because of the appalling scale of the violation that is visited upon her, and because she is innocent. And that is Peckinpah's point. He said that violence must be shown for what it is: horrifying, brutalizing, destructive. The arrival of Norman escalates the scene to a newly terrible level. Charlie sees Norman, and at first he's unwilling to relinquish Amy. he is subject to divided loyalties. He feels the connection to her as a lover and also to his mate. What we will be seeing now is a longer and more explicit cut of the second rape of Amy by Norman. This edit of the scene was not released to American audiences when the film was in distribution in 1971. It escalates the violence to an appalling level by providing explicit details of what Norman is doing to Amy and of Charlie's participation in that. In the shorter cut of the scene, the action is more impressionistic, and one can't really tell what Charlie is doing. Here, he is clearly holding her down for Norman. Peckinpah's camera dwells again on the extent of Amy's suffering, and the scene takes us beyond any point at which we thought the film would stop. This choking action replicates the action that we've seen already performed with Janice by her brother, and it anticipates what will happen with Henry and Janice later in the film. At last, the sequence comes to its end, and the viewer must reflect upon the proper threshold of acceptable violent action. Peckinpah here has taken us far beyond anywhere that we thought he would go or that a film of this period would go. Taking us there, Peckinpah was intent on connecting violence with suffering, both for the characters in the film who are subjected to it and for the viewer watching the movie. In a production memo, he told his producers that he had no interest in detailing the physical aspects of the rape on Amy. He said, "I have no intention of coming anywhere near pornography. Genitalia do not interest me. The emotional havoc that happens to Amy is the basis of our story." Susan George's performance here and throughout the film is pitch perfect, and it cost her considerable pain. Peckinpah's method of working with actors involved creating the world of the film on camera as well as off camera. He would manipulate his actors in order to keep them off balance, and sometimes with great cruelty, until they became the characters in the film and the line between performing and being had vanished. Peckinpah treated Susan George quite well up to the point in production where the rape occurs, after which he became quite cruel. Dustin Hoffman did the same, she reported, and she felt devastated. That real emotional experience seeped into her performance and deepened her depiction of Amy's anguish. Many film directors, and no doubt some of the viewers listening to this commentary, would object to this way of working as unethical. Nevertheless, it was Peckinpah's way, and most of the actors who worked with him stayed loyal. Susan George, for example, said that she believes to this day and always will that Peckinpah was a genius, and that she was willing to take anything and everything he had to give. To appreciate the powerful results that this way of working can produce, one need only ask oneself if any of the performers in this film, save possibly for Hoffman, seem to be actors giving a performance.
When are you ever going to learn about growing up, huh?
I'm trying to.
Well, you're a little late. Why didn't you ask them instead of making me look like an idiot with that bowl of milk?
You're a coward.
We see again here how far from a conventional film Peckinpah is making. This is not a story-driven film. In a story-driven film, Amy would tell David at some point what has happened, but she never tells him. Instead, he takes out his rage on her in this scene from being left alone on the moor by the gang. It's very unjustified rage, but it's another moment like the scene with the cat that tells us how deeply angry David is. He does see her suffering, leans in and begins to nuzzle her neck. And when he does this, Peckinpah again gives attention to her anguish, reprising her point of view with images of the rape, match cut with shots of David kissing her neck. Although the camera perspective in the reprised cuts is not subjective, the editing makes them so by taking us into Amy's mind and showing us the devastation that has occurred there. Furthermore, the cutting links David to the rape once again and tells us about the depth of Amy's alienation from him.
Now listen to me. You're fired because I don't want you around. I want you to leave. Right now.
Now, at last, he finally confronts the gang and fires them, but not because he knows about the rape. Like the information about the cat, that's just a story point. Look at the way that Dustin Hoffman trips over this rock as he walks away. Hoffman is very good at catching David's clumsiness.
Ditto. What's ditto?
Yeah, you got Sheila.
Just a moment.
Fast, I tell you.
Peckinpah now gives us an extraordinarily desolate scene. It's David standing outside the house, alone, watching darkness fall. The shot's connected with a series of dissolves until he's finally joined by Amy, who comes out to remind him about the church social. We don't often see scenes in American movies that are pitched at this level of emotional desolation. The expression on his face, once again, the landscape. David and Amy are in emotional hell. The marriage is barren, and all of this gets powerful expression. The exteriors were shot in Cornwall on the Land's End Peninsula, the southwesternmost tip of the British Isles. They were shooting in winter, and cinematographer John Coqueline captures these wonderfully bleak vistas, drained of color and seemingly of life itself. Conventional interpretations of the film claim that it glorifies crimes like rape and murder. For that to be the case, the movie would have to be celebrating something. But all that Peckinpah shows us is loss and devastation. This scene gives us one of the purest expressions of these qualities. When David and Amy attend this church social, Peckinpah launches into the most extended poetic and subjective interlude in the film, and once again the point of view is Amy's. As with the rape, the subjective design of the scene was not scripted. Peckinpah created it while filming and then editing so that the scene would take the point of view of the victim of violence, not the attackers, and portray the consequences of that violence for the victim. This structural feature of the scene, and Peckinpah's attentiveness to Amy's anguish, is significantly at odds with the conventional view of the film, which asserts that the movie endorses Amy's brutalization. Were that the case, however, it seems very unlikely that Peckinpah would have worked so hard to take us inside the victim's suffering as he does here. The cutting is extremely quick throughout the scene. Many of these shots are less than 1 second in duration, and some are as brief as 4 frames and qualify as subliminal images of the sort that we noted in the rape scene. 2 things are accomplished by this editing. In one, we see that Amy recalls the rape when she sees her attackers at the hall, and images of the attack are reprised as scenes in her mind. But the second thing that happens is that her nausea and distress erupt onto the ordinary sights and sounds of the church social. Amy's internal distress explodes onto the outer world of ordinary event and behavior. Those noisemakers that we've been hearing, for example, become extremely harsh and increasingly phallic in their appearance as Amy associates them with her rape. Because Peckinpah wanted to create the world that he was shaping in the film, he would often do things to his actors to encourage their immersion in the character. For example, here, Susan George had to portray Amy with such anguish. Before she went on camera, Peckinpah told her that her father seemed very ill, that he didn't look very well, and that Peckinpah privately thought that perhaps he didn't have long to live. This took Mrs. George quite aback, and her off-balance emotional feelings are perfectly suited to the kind of action that she then had to play in the scene. That sort of a stunt is very typical of Peckinpah. He would often emotionally ambush his performers in ways that were calculated to elicit from them a more believable, credible level of performance. Just as the noisemakers intensify Amy's distress, so does the Reverend Hood's little show. His remark, "I think you'll find it hasn't been torn at all," will be placed by the editing inside of Amy's ordeal. We will hear it inside a reprised image of Charlie Venner on top of Amy, and the montage then references this with other events in the hall.
It hasn't been torn at all.
This rush of shots tells us that the rape has altered Amy's relationship to the village. Once at ease there, she is now estranged from her people. The poetic and psychological montages that we see throughout this sequence are among Peckinpah's supreme achievements as a filmmaker. The popular understanding of Peckinpah sees him as just a bloodthirsty director who filled his movies with lots of violence, and his editing is identified with physical action. This is what Peckinpah's editing is most identified with in the public mind: lots of violent death, often in slow motion. He was probably initially drawn toward montage as a means for presenting that kind of material, for stylizing physical violence. But he quickly realized its limitations. He didn't want to just keep filming gun battles. And following The Wild Bunch, he began to take his montages into the kind of poetic and psychological direction that we see in these sequences in Straw Dogs. In Straw Dogs, these poetic montages approach a point where they begin to destroy narrative, to overwhelm its linear structure with the kaleidoscopic energies of Amy's distress, as the rape overwhelms her world and draws David, the villagers, and the church social into the turmoil in her mind. The events depicted in the montage do not follow a narrative logic, but a psychological one. Following Straw Dogs, Peckinpah used this kind of montage again and again in his later pictures, so that it really becomes one of his most frequently used elements of style. He was therefore much more than a filmmaker who used montage just to convey physical action. His psychological montages explore the subjective experiences of trauma, pain, and alienation, and these were expressly associated with violence as its human cost.
Dad, it's Janice. She made off to the yard, then she went walking with Henry Niles. He was holding her, Dad.
Of the actors in this film, apart from Dustin Hoffman, Peter Vaughan has probably had the most successful screen career. You can see him in supporting roles in a large and varied number of films, although, as I've said, his power in this film tends to get a little bit in the way of his appearances in other movies. David Warner, who plays Henry Niles, is also a prolific film actor, and he was a friend of Peckinpah's. In fact, it was that friendship that landed him a role in this film. Warner had been involved in a bizarre incident where he fell or jumped out of a window and hurt his legs. You'll see that he's hobbling around in the movie, as a result of which no film company wanted to give him employment, and he was uninsurable. Peckinpah would often hire people like that who had been somehow stigmatized within the industry. So he gave Warner the role of Henry Niles, and it was a gesture of friendship and sympathy.
Get your mates to find her. I'll be waiting in the pub. Get all of them.
Would you like to kiss me?
The film now moves into its last act. And the violence that will occupy us in that last section of the film is precipitated by the accidental killing of Janice Hedden.
Would you now all please stand?
To take us there, Peckinpah is going to intercut this action with Janice and Henry with a very peculiar presentation of the church service. It's like a black mass. Though Amy has left the hall with David, something of her trauma remains behind to poison the atmosphere of the church and transmute the prayer service into a kind of black mass that has a human sacrifice in Janice hidden. Despite the fact that the killing is not intended, Peckinpah integrates the action with the black mass by intercutting the two lines of action. The world in this film has always been a very primitive one, but never more so from this point on. The human sacrifice, which appears to be blessed by the church service, leads to a kind of group-sanctioned, ritualized violence when the gang of rowdies attack the Sumners. Henry has not meant to kill Janice. This is another plot point that, like David's lack of knowledge of Amy's rape and the identity of who killed the cat, events in the film are going to rush rapidly over. The rowdies drink in anticipation of the coming slaughter. Peckinpah's world here is so deranged and off-kilter that it is, once again, surprising that commentators would find in the film only conventional messages of heroism. What is one to make of all of this? It's as if we, like Alice in Wonderland, have passed through a looking-glass world, except the one that we thought we were in, however horrifying it was, has become now a kind of nightmare unconscious, a world of primal impulse and desire, where normal reality is inverted. It's a nightmare from which we are not going to be allowed to awake. When David and Amy hit Henry Niles in their car, the film will move quickly into the final act. It's a final act that has given rise to much confusion about the film, with commentators suggesting that Peckinpah is applauding and endorsing David's slaughter of Tom Hedden's gang. Whether reviewers liked this movie or hated it, they all tended to say the same thing about it, namely that this is a movie that celebrates the killer ape instinct, that shows the transformation of a meek pacifist into a real man by the act of killing. Supposedly, as an academic, David is less than a real man before he takes up violence. Joan Mellon, who hated the film, wrote that Peckinpah is saying that, quote, only violence against other men can prepare a male to be a lover skillful enough to satisfy a sexually alive woman, unquote. Joseph Morgenstern, the reviewer for Newsweek, who loved this movie, wrote that, quote, it flawlessly expresses the belief that manhood requires rites of violence, unquote. Wherever one looks, this is the received wisdom on the film, that it offers a spectacle of heroic, redemptive violence that transforms this inadequate man into a potent lover. As Pauline Kael observed, this is a Neanderthal idea, and she too hated the movie, calling it a fascist work of art. The problem, though, is that these ideas do not describe Peckinpah's intentions or the film as he designed it. They are caricatures that mock and distort the work, and most of all, fail to perceive the ironies at work in the picture. For these caricatures to be true, David would need to be the hero of the picture, the character whom Peckinpah wishes his audience to admire and whom he applauds. Whether they love or hate the movie, critics uniformly believe that David is Peckinpah's mouthpiece. We can forgive them this view because so many American films work in precisely these terms, but not this one. David was the villain of the picture for Peckinpah. When the critics Pauline Kael and Richard Schickel, writing in The New Yorker and Life magazine, called David the film's hero, Peckinpah wrote each of them a letter saying that he was surprised that they didn't pick up on the fact that David was the film's heavy. Peckinpah also wrote to Pauline Kael to protest her use of the term fascist to describe this film. As a former Marine and one who was part of the World War II effort in China, the term fascism had a very specific connotation to Peckinpah, and he was offended by its application in relation to the film.
Have Henry Niles in there?
Wait a minute, is the doctor with you?
Oh, we want to see Niles.
No. Why, what's the matter? Wake up!
Peckinpah reprises the encirclement motif in this scene, which is a standoff between David and the gang. You can see how they're surrounding him here as Amy watches from the stairs. Peckinpah creates a complex tapestry of dialogue and reaction shots. Amy watches from a distance, appropriate because her loyalties are divided. She doesn't want Niles in the house. She wants David to give him up to the gang. This scene gives us a splendid example of Peckinpah's ironies. It contains one of David's big moments of self-assertion, which Peckinpah carefully undercuts.
Put your hands on me. It's none of your business. And it never has been.
That's fine.
As always, his ironies are relatively implicit, and he wants the attentive viewer to realize the roots of this conflict and how complex they are. For one thing, he shows us that the conflict involves a clash of culture as much as personality. The locals resent the projection of American wealth and privilege into their community. And we learned that Norman especially has felt this resentment for a very long time. In this respect, Norman's attack on Amy was also a means for getting back at this American intellectual and the class barriers that have kept him under David's thumb. Norman resents David's meddling, telling him that the village is not his affair, and it never has been. The group now begins to argue over who's going to go and who's going to stay for the doctor. David tells them that they'd really do much better looking for Janice rather than staying here and wasting time.
You'd be better off looking for Janice Hedden than just standing around here, you know?
And David says that no, he won't leave Niles alone with his wife, contradicting his earlier assertions that Niles is harmless. Look at Norman's outburst here. It's one of tremendous resentment in class and cultural terms.
Yeah, you wouldn't leave him alone with your wife or your kid if you had one. Oh, that's different, huh?
Look, fella. He's staying here with me until the doctor and the police arrive. He's my responsibility.
We get a low-angle shot of David here that makes him look more impressive. There's a long pause before David says, "This is my house." He emphasizes that pause by cutting in 5 reaction shots of the group waiting for the answer.
This is my house.
But he is mistaken. The house and the furniture in it belong to Amy's father. It's village property. David, though, understands his relation to the house in more personal terms. He will lay claim to them, and he's going to draw the line here. Psychodynamically speaking, if he can keep the gang out of the house, he can protect the well-armored components of his psyche where he contains the rage that is too threatening to acknowledge.
Bastard say?
Talk.
Well, why didn't you make him? That's what you went in there for?
There's a storm that's brewing outside, and the action from this point on in the film will be alternating between these two locations. The house, which is a set, it's an interior set, and then the exteriors, which are shot on a real exterior in Cornwall at night in the winter. Tom begins to pound on the door, and David assures Amy, with some smugness, that it's a very thick door and they can't break through it. And now he truly reaches the height of his idiocy when he tells Amy, "Relax, I know how they'd feel."
I'd feel the same way if it was my kid that was missing.
Trying to reassure her by sounding compassionate, as if that had any relevance to anything. From this point on, Peckinpah's camera setups get even wilder than they've been up to now, with the camera at a tilt, lurching crazily to one side in many of the shots. This makes the world on screen look really deranged, creates a tremendously unstable visual perspective on the action that matches what Peckinpah has been doing to his viewers dramatically with the characters, keeping them off balance with ironies that frustrate our abilities to form simple allegiances with them. In the storm of violence that is now approaching, we're going to be buffeted and tossed about because Peckinpah doesn't give us a clear place from which to stand.
And if you don't clear out now, there'll be real trouble. I mean it.
We're seeing a wonderful magical illusion in this last act of the film. The intercutting that I mentioned between the action inside the house and outside involves material that was filmed in different times and places. All of the exteriors, these are the shots like the ones we're seeing now, these were all shot in St. Buryan on the Land's End Peninsula. They're using a real farmhouse, and they're really going to do it some damage. It was January and February, the dead of winter, and very unpleasant for the actors to be filming in the cold at night, and Peckinpah really had to get people psyched up in order to do this kind of hard physical stuff. And that says a lot about his ability to create a kind of spirit of camaraderie on a set. All of the exterior filming on the production was done first, and then the company moved to Twickenham Studios in London to shoot the interiors. These are the shots like the ones we're seeing now. That's a studio set.
Look, you stupid Indian. Let's have Niles before...
When Peckinpah cuts back and forth from the Hedden gang outside, beating on the house, to David and Amy's reactions inside, he's joining footage that was shot months apart and locations that are many miles from one another. The Hedden gang isn't outside the house when we're in it with David and Amy, and David and Amy aren't inside the house when we're outside with the gang. It's editing magic.
That's what they want.
This is one of the pivotal scenes in the film. It gives David his other big moment of self-assertion, and once again Peckinpah's perspective here is ironic. Amy wants to get rid of Niles, David resists. And Peckinpah told his editors to expand this time. He said, hang on them, hang on the shot of David, hang on the shot of Amy. Because this is a key scene, Peckinpah wanted to amplify its resonances. When David says that this is where I live, that this is me, I will not allow violence against this house, he makes his big assertion of principle. And we can read it simply as a heroic moment, and certainly many critics have done so. But look at how he blocks the action. Peckinpah's got David at the foot of the stairs, and he's shooting down on him from a high angle.
This is where I live. This is me.
This is not a very impressive visual perspective. It diminishes his presence in the frame, and it undercuts the strength of what he's saying. This framing suggests that Peckinpah's relationship with David here is ambivalent. Furthermore, while he seems to take the moral high ground, he voices his principles without emotion or passion. He seems to have mainly an intellectual commitment to them, not a deeply felt one. Amy's willingness to give Niles to the gang is the most selfish and self-interested behavior we've seen from her, and it's shocking, but again it's complex. Amy has suffered sexual violence, and Niles is a sex offender. Her own pain compels her to keep him from the house. Major Scott now arrives and brings the promise of rescue.
Sorry I didn't get here earlier.
Yeah, I am too, you know. They're breaking all my windows.
But he's going to be dispatched by the Hedden gang, and Peckinpah will take us really around the bend. Major Scott rather overestimates his abilities. The gang tosses a rat through the window. Remember that rats is life, and Major Scott rushes outside to deal with them. This is a scene where T.P. McKenna's arm cast really works for the action, accentuating the vulnerability of the character. The great thing about Peckinpah's violence is his ability to give it a sense of horror and loss. Scott's killing is very fast, despite the use of the slow-motion inserts, but the aftermath is quite prolonged. Scott's going to grab the gun, it's going to go off, there'll be a few quick inserts of him flying backwards, and then most of the scene is going to dwell on what happens next, the character's reactions to the killing.
There wouldn't have been any trouble if you put Henry Niles away.
They haven't really planned on anyone to get killed, and now things have escalated beyond a point that they can handle. Look at these great shots of David and Amy, the wide-angle lens on their faces. and the quick pullback from the camera that expresses their response. Violence in Peckinpah's films is not casual. It hurts the viewer, and as a filmmaker, he registers its consequences. In this respect, the climaxes of this film and The Wild Bunch are rather different from one another. Wild Bunch climaxes with a scene of unending visual slaughter, which is hypnotic in the power that it exerts over the viewer. In Straw Dogs, he doesn't give us that kind of unending spectacle. He breaks in on the violence with the shifting dramas among the characters, keeping us off balance, whereas The Wild Bunch is uninterrupted and unreflective. In Straw Dogs, Peckinpah provokes the viewer to reflect on the feelings that the film's violence arouses, and his idea is that the viewer should not like what they find. A good example of his ability to break in on the violence and keep us off balance is this debate between Amy and David over giving up Niles. Notice David's exaggerated display of calm in contrast to Amy's terror and near hysteria. David is unable to respond to Amy's distress with any degree of empathy.
I can hold them off. Now, don't worry, someone will show up.
Instead, he declares with an eerie calm that he's going to keep them out of the house. In the context of what is happening and Amy's own distress, this is a weirdly dissociated, entirely abstract goal that shows us the degree to which David is still playing games, except that now they involve people's lives. Peckinpah's cameras lurch off balance, and David screams at Amy to get upstairs, and once up there, he's going to treat her with even more contempt. We have, therefore, really two narrative lines that are ongoing in the climax. One is the action narrative about the siege and the physical violence. The other details the abuse of Amy by David, which, although it's been ongoing throughout the film, is now much more intense and explicit. Peckinpah juggles these two lines throughout the climax so that our judgments about David, particularly about whether he becomes a hero by defending the house, must hinge ultimately on how he treats Amy, both during the siege and then afterward. Her crime for David is that she doesn't want to play this game. Although it's the physical violence that gives the film its visceral climax, it's the abuse of Amy that here as elsewhere is at the heart of the film. Straw Dogs is a film about male brutality toward women.
I'm talking to you. Do we have any rope?
No.
I suggest you get out of the way of the windows.
Peckinpah, though, had a keen sense of the ugliness within the male psyche, and he put it on display here at greater length than was customary in many of his other works, meanwhile giving the film's subjectivity over to Amy. Peckinpah himself was emotionally off balance, subject to fits of tenderness and rage, and so his movie has these qualities. There are points in this film where he regards every character with skepticism and hostility, including Amy. It is this more than anything that makes the film so unusual. Without a compass, he ventures into very scary territory and explores this kind of brutality in an up-close and disturbing way that always threatens to engulf the viewer. Ultimately, the terror that Straw Dogs instills in the viewer is this fear of being engulfed by the violence and swept away by it. The weirdness of the last act of the film is evident here in all the attention that Peckinpah devotes to the childish antics of the gang outside on the bicycles. Ridaway goes chasing after Chris Causey, threatening to brain him with a bike, and then in the next moment they both come around the corner like children on their tricycles. Amy comes down the stairs and leads us into a scene where she now begins to withdraw her loyalties from David. This is the most damning indictment of him that she makes in the film. She tells David that she's going to leave him if he doesn't give up Niles, and at the window, Charlie tries to persuade her to open the door.
Wait there, I'm coming, Charlie.
Wait, Tom.
No, David.
He manages to get Tom's gun out the door, Charlie overhears this moment of struggle between David and Amy, and it's possible that Amy might prevail in Charlie's view. So he's going to give them this moment.
Don't let them have what they want. And I'm going.
Look at the cruel expression on David's face. It's the face of a robot, devoid of feeling and expression. In a taunting way, he dares her to go to the door. And when she does so, with the kind of directness that we've seen so often from her in the film, in a rage, he rips her away from the door, slapping her like Charlie had done earlier. If the viewer compares the expression of the two men, David here and Charlie's face during the scene in the rape where he's beating her, you'll see that their expressions are virtually identical. Peckinpah wanted Amy's reactions here to be emphasized, and he told his editors to use her response to the slap in close-up, not the two-shot. The presentation again emphasizes her suffering, and again it ties David's behavior to that of the rapist, Charlie Venner. Peckinpah's occasional use of slow motion in the film is more extensive here in this nice little montage intercutting David's remarks to Amy with the rowdies smashing the windows. Although Arthur Penn and Bonnie and Clyde had used slow motion in 1967, it was Peckinpah who became most closely identified with this device, and whose influence made slow motion montage into the essential template for doing movie violence, an influence that lasted for generations. It's only recently that filmmakers have discarded slow motion violence in favor of montages that use normal speed action.
Get in and slip along and open the door.
Thanks. Make bloody sure Tom don't fire at me.
He won't, I'll be there.
I want to interrupt my commentary on the action in the film a little bit here to talk about the importance of slow motion action for Peckinpah. When The Wild Bunch premiered, critics hailed Peckinpah's slow motion for its realism. Peckinpah didn't think of slow motion, though, as providing greater realism. He used it to stylize violence, and on this point he was very clear. He felt that by stylizing violence, that's a really brutal piece of violence there, and viewers often flinch when they see it. Peckinpah felt that the slow motion that he provided would jolt viewers out of a realistic frame and into a more artificial one, and that this contrast could distance them from the phenomenon of violence on film, open it up. Now, a modern viewer might feel somewhat skeptical that Peckinpah could really think this way, because today slow-motion violence seems to be completely unremarkable. But context is important. Peckinpah benefited from the fall of censorship in the late 1960s, and he used it to overturn decades of movie conventions in which people died painless, sanitized deaths. He said, "I was always fascinated to see how easily one died in the movies. People die without suffering, and violence has no pain." In this context, after so many years of sanitized violence, Peckinpah's bloody, stylized treatment of violence was revolutionary. It did explode convention and make people sit up and take notice. This has made graphic violence today much more routine. But in Peckinpah's day, it wasn't routine, and so his work had real impact of a sort that it probably would not have today. The relationships among the characters in the climax of the film are constantly shifting. We see now David do something that he's never done before in the film. He comes to Amy's defense. David leaps to, if not her rescue, then at least something that gestures in that direction.
Come on. Come on.
This is going to lead now into some of the best action editing in the film. David's got that vinegar boiling, and he's going to fling it onto the gang, and then he and Amy will try to put out the fire. The editing here is full of lots of jump cuts that make the action look violent and disconnected, and Peckinpah's camera angles are wildly off balance.
Bastard. Okay. Okay, take it easy.
The compositions tilt in an out-of-control fashion, and he jump cuts a number of slow-motion inserts into the normal speed scene. He's also using a handheld camera, one of the few points in the film where he uses one, and this catches the action with quick, jerky pans and tilts. He's used an incredible number of camera setups to film this. Very few are repeated compositions, and they create a quick flurry of non-redundant imagery. It's a brief little sequence, but a bravura display of filmmaking skill, and it shows us why Peckinpah was one of the great action filmmakers. Watching Peckinpah's work, one is reminded of what good action filmmaking is really like. The progressive barricading of David and Amy inside the house helps to build suspense and tension, as gradually, door by door, the gang breaches their safe haven, and they're reduced to piling up furniture in a desperate effort to keep the gang at bay. At the same time, David is able to use his keen mind to strategize various means of defense. We've seen one in the boiling liquid that he throws on the gang. And in just a moment, he's going to devise another strategy for defense, and this will involve the boastful display of music. David's glasses, which are the emblem of his intellectual status, have now been shattered. The gang outside mobilizes, and David gets an idea. He's going to put on the bagpipe music as a way of signaling that he's inside, defiant, and ready for them. With this music, the bloodbath begins, and the killing for which the film is famous happens rather quickly. This is a surprising fact, given the reputation that the film has, but it shows us how careful Peckinpah was in his design. Most of what we've witnessed for the past 20 minutes is principally violence against property. Once the killing begins, Peckinpah will get it over with very quickly, while intensifying the film's already unbearable level of emotional tension. Tom Hedden is going to have his foot blown apart in a rather spectacular special effect.
I've got you, Tom! What's the matter, Tom?
The fact that the killings and the violence only occur at length in the final moments of the film tell us that Peckinpah did not treat film violence as a routine thing. These striking wide-angle shots dramatically extend the size and length of David's gun, and when it misfires, Ridaway gives the same giddy laugh that the Wild Bunch make after shooting General Mapache. When Ridaway charges David and is beaten, Peckinpah is very discreet in what he shows. After the first blow, Ridaway falls out of the frame, and the scene cuts away to Norman on the roof and then to Chris Causey here in the house. Only a couple of the blows in this knife and poker fight land on camera. Causey then falls behind the sofa, and Peckinpah frames David beating him to death with Causey off camera so that the viewer sees none of the gruesome physical damage that is occurring. Most of the action plays in the master shot as David beats Causey, with very few close-ups. Peckinpah insisted on that with his editors. He said, "Go straight to the master when David gets in the first hit." This discreet approach shows us that Peckinpah remained a moralist. He did not want to rub his viewer's face in the violence. It was the psychological elements, not the physical ones, that interested him in the film. This now is a key scene in the film, one very important for Peckinpah. David is filled with nausea and self-loathing. He has just beaten a man to death.
Gun's empty.
Is it now?
Looking at Charlie's gun, he tells Venner to pull the trigger.
Want me to pull it and show me?
As he did in the scene with Amy and David on the stairs, Peckinpah told his editors to expand the scene. Peckinpah specifically cited this scene when he wrote to several critics to rebut their condemnation of the movie. The viewer, though, has to infer David's reaction because Peckinpah doesn't show it directly. David's outward calm and his flip remark to Charlie conceal his nausea. Amy, now attacked by Norman upstairs, calls out to both David and Charlie, prompting both of them to rush upstairs and for the film to give us yet another reversal of allegiance among the characters. Norman asks Charlie to take David downstairs. finish him off, and then come back up where he and Norman can have Amy at their leisure. Charlie, though, who's had divided loyalties all along, now decides to side with Amy. And when Charlie shoots Norman, after this tense standoff full of the classic Peckinpah reaction shots, when Charlie does shoot Norman and David attacks him, Peckinpah is going to give us the longest slow-motion inserts of his career. These here. I'm not sure that these slow-motion shots work especially well. Typically, Peckinpah's inserts with slow motion are very brief, so his editors can move into and out of the decelerated moments in a very fluid way. Longer inserts like these tend to slow the flow of action, something that Peckinpah's slow motion very rarely does. But it gets us to the bottom of the stairs, where Peckinpah's able to use his great prop, the animal trap. And when David brings it down on Charlie's head, the moment is horrifying, but it's presented with the same discretion we've seen in the other deaths. Peckinpah eliminated the close-ups that he had filmed of Charlie's head in the trap and let Venner's death play out in the master shot. He told his editors to use the master, not the close-ups. This gives a slight distancing on Venner's death, and the close-ups are reserved for Amy to show us her response to the violence. As always, Peckinpah is taking his camera to her suffering. Peckinpah gives us 6 shots of Amy's response. Here's an example of one of these close-ups. David rights the chair and puts it against the wall in a futile effort to restore the house to what it once was. But he's won nothing that he said he was fighting for. The house is breached and destroyed, his marriage to Amy is probably over, and David finds that the violence has taken him to a place he no longer recognizes. He now here feels a brief moment of primitive triumph.
Jesus. I got them all.
Before Ridaway attacks him in action that now feels, today, somewhat reminiscent of those awful slasher horror movies in which the monster never finally stays down dead. Ridaway's attack is especially brutal. Peckinpah's point here is that it takes a lot for Amy to pick up the gun. We've seen the male characters moving rather quickly to violence. Even David, once he's made the decision to use violence, seems at home with it. Amy, by contrast, does not carry the kind of rage within her that David does, and violence is not a part of her world in the way that it is for the gang of men in the village. So she pauses for an infinitely long time. Once again, Susan George is just magnificent in the depth of her portrayal, in the way that she catches Amy's terror and revulsion.
Is it gone? Amy?
Violence in Peckinpah's world is not a casual response. What now follows is the film's extraordinary conclusion, in which David abandons Amy, who seems harmed irreparably. It's difficult to imagine that she will be able to recover from this degree of trauma. And instead of remaining with his wife, David will barely ask if she's all right, and instead he'll go up and rescue Henry Niles from the attic and drive off into the night with him. It's remarkable that critics of the film have been so intent on its being a celebration of violence. There's nothing uplifting here. Peckinpah shows only loss, destruction, pain, and isolation. Far from being a movie that advocates violence or its release as a healthy expression, Peckinpah shows the horrible consequences of violence. There were 3 different endings that Peckinpah wrestled with during production, and all but one had David and Amy being reconciled. Significantly, he chose the one that was bleakest and most ambiguous, and that separated husband and wife. Amy seems psychologically demolished. In some ways, she will never leave this house of violence. It is fitting, therefore, that we end with her confined within it. David, on the other hand, is now lost and wandering in the darkness, forever torn from the world that he had inhabited and unable to find his way back.
Okay.
Peckinpah's great abiding theme as an artist was human violence, and he wanted to caution his viewers about its terrible nature. "I attempt to portray violence for what it is," he said. "We are a violent people and have been since the beginning. We should understand the nature of our affliction and channel it, not close our eyes and hope that it will go away, because it won't, not ever." About his work, he said, "I tried to emphasize the sense of horror that violence provides." Straw Dogs is the supreme expression of this idea. He wanted this to terrify viewers and leave them feeling like David does at the end, driving into the darkness. Peckinpah knew that this would be a painful film for his viewers, but its lessons about the terrible consequences of rage could be useful, he felt, in a world that seems to tolerate so much real rage and violence. By provoking his viewers, he thought he could lead them to deeper self-reflection. Of course, not many would want to take this trip, and many more would hate Peckinpah for what he put on film here. He knew what the film would cost him. He said, "I'm afraid that the truth to me as I see it is more important than entertainment for its own sake. The unfortunate thing is I see a certain kind of truth only too clearly." He pursued that truth ruthlessly here, giving us his best film and a modern classic that is long overdue for the recognition that it deserves.